Here we are outside the Palace of Westminster, the mother of parliaments, the fountainhead of democracy. But the New Europeans say that up to 1 million people were effectively deprived of the right to vote in the recent European elections. What are the MPs going to do about it? Find out in the Alex Salmond Show, on air and online.
Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we continue our examination of the voting scandal with up to 1 million people prevented from voting in the European elections this May. These were the elections which were never meant to be, but which took place as a result of the Brexit deadline being extended following Theresa May's inability to secure Commons backing for her Brexit deal. However, the problems were not unanticipated, and there had been ample prior warnings that the system of allowing European citizens to vote had not been operating properly. We heard from people who were refused their right to vote.
It just feels like this. I almost feel like I'm being extracted from the community I was embedded in, and I think that was the most upsetting thing. It feels like I'm being moved to the outer circle, as it were, and I think a lot of us EU citizens who've been here for a long time under, mutual agreement between the countries are now suddenly feeling like we're being, pushed out. And that's emotionally really difficult.
And from the Secretary-General of the New Europeans Organisation, who have claimed that up to 1 million people were effectively denied their right to vote.
Over 1 million EU citizens who we believe were prevented from voting in the European elections, which they have the right to do.
In this week's show, we talk to legal authorities and to MPs in Brussels and Westminster on both the political fallout and on whether those affected can get any form of redress.
Let's make sure that all European Union countries know, under particular issues in the eastern side of Europe, that they know that if this sort of behaviour happens, this symbolic behaviour that we've seen in the United Kingdom with 1 million people disenfranchised, is not a penalty-less action.
Now, we've asked the government for reaction, but they're standing pat on the explanations already offered to the House of Commons.
I think we have to be clear that this is exactly the same process that was required back in 2014 and in 2009. And this is a legal structure of how this vote takes place that has not changed.
In last week's show, we focused on the prospect of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. This week, Boris duly triumphed in the race against Jeremy Hunt. In our show, leading political commentators discussed how Johnson would handle not just Brexit, but the multiple issues in the number 10 in-tray, including Scotland.
Let him try.
And the crisis with Iran.
As with Iran, I think it would be catastrophic for us to follow the US.
Our top Tory tipster, Peter Oborne, suggested that no self-respecting Prime Minister should associate with President Trump, given his racist views as illustrated by his controversial go-home attack on 4 US Congresswomen. Since then, and with the US House of Representatives passing a resolution in similar terms, the President has responded to the furore surrounding his tweets, denying he's a racist and adding, "I don't have a racist bone in my body."
Well, there's been quite a bit of reaction to our first show on the European elections and the voting rights of European citizens. Lynn Finlayson says, amazing interview with Roger Casal. He was right to compare the scandal to the Windrush scandal and describe the UK as a hostile environment. Kizzy Wiz says, great interviews. I was very troubled by the reports that EU citizens had been disenfranchised in the EU election. Thanks for this. Watch your show every week. Well done. And Robert Knight continues that theme by saying, we really can't have people who have contributed so much to society being treated in such an unfair way. This should never be allowed to reoccur. Liz MacLeod says, I think we should have international watchdogs here for the next Scottish referendum. And Peter says, hi from sunny Ayrshire. This goes to show the incompetence, culpability of the establishment when this sort of thing is still permitted to occur, and Westminster merely hand waves it away. And on something of the same theme, John Ligett says, good evening, Big Ek. Gaze the wave I've been asking for so long. Just for you, John. Here's the wave.
So plenty of concern from viewers, But is there a route forward for those prevented from voting? Alex asked Open University lecturer Dr. Robert Palmer to evaluate the options for legal redress.
Now, to discuss some of the legal implications of this situation, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Robert Palmer, the lecturer in law at the Open University. Robert, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you, Alex.
Let's have a look at this. I mean, what is the base in law of the right to vote? I mean, it's something people take for granted, but are you guaranteed that right in law?
In EU law, UK law, international law, there are the right to vote is clear. On European Union terms, it's quite convoluted. It goes in the Treaty of European Union, Treaty of the Function of European Union, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. They all correspond with one another. They have a common theme through them, the universal suffrage every 5 years for the parliamentary elections in Europe. There will have to be a universal procedure. All countries must have the same rules, etc. Of course, it's a fundamental right as well because of the Charter of Fundamental Rights in EU terms. It's a primary law source, same as our Acts of Parliament. So the two treaties and the CFR are all sources of primary law.
So we understand that perhaps the estimates are up to 1 million people were effectively, practically denied the right to vote. Who's responsible? I mean, who is held to account for that situation arising?
The Cabinet Office are responsible for ensuring that the laws are abided by, so that they actually abide with the treaties. The Electoral Commission generally is there to ensure that the law is enforced, but with the European Parliament elections, it was a little bit different because with the disenfranchisements, you're looking at the registration officer, the electoral registration officers. So the redress, where you normally, if there was a problem with overspends, etc., they'd be going to the Electoral Commission. But you have to complain to your local authority in the first instance. Of course, that produces state liability, which means your avenue for redress is judicial review.
So is the judicial review, does that mean you can progress on human rights grounds? Your human rights have been infringed, or can you actually sue the government and say, you've cost me my right to vote, therefore you'll have to pay for it? What exactly are the forms of legal redress for being deprived of your right to vote?
The problem with human rights is it is almost our last avenue of redress, unless any potential judicial review cases that might be imminent. There would have to be that argument within, so any violations of the conventions would have to be argued within the judicial review proceedings themselves. If that's not done, there wouldn't be an avenue to Strasbourg, which is problematic, but there is, of course, the Article 3, Protocol 1 right to vote. If you look at the International Convention of Civil and Political Rights, Article 25, it kind of lots of aspects of the European Convention of Human Rights actually mirror that, even though the optional protocol hasn't been ratified by the UK. So there is no redress to the Human Rights Council.
So it's not a simple matter, but we hear that there could be an investigation at European level, that there's potential court cases domestically. What is the end game of this? I mean, could the UK be fined, or is it just a matter of the UK being held into further disrepute? And these domestic court cases, could some European citizens deprived of the right to vote be financially compensated for what happened?
The idea that it may be rerun would be a political matter that is unlikely that any cases would be trying to pursue for.
So that would be an ultimate thing, to rerun the whole election?
Yeah, it would have to be election regional specific. They wouldn't be able to run the whole of the European elections again. But from what I can gather, all the disenfranchisements are in England alone. How many regions, I don't know. So if you look at the political aspect or the will, even in the European Union or the United Kingdom government, whether the political will to rerun them would be there. Politically, it would be suicide, I think, if the European Union decided to rerun the entire election. You could have it regional Pacific, but I imagine the European Union would be a little bit worried about the climate at the moment, for they say, well, we're going to have to rerun this. So that would probably stop the will. It's not saying it's impossible. Of course it's possible. There would be an avenue for compensation. I imagine it wouldn't be worthwhile to pursue certain sides of the compensatory schemes that they have. It might be for travel expenses, things like that. But there needs to be a remedy in judicial review. You would need standing, which they have. We know we have them standing.
So looking at it from a position of a lawyer looking in on this, Robert Palmer, are you surprised there's not more parliamentary outrage? You know, we've had an election, albeit an election that was perhaps a surprise that it took place at all to many people, but an election nonetheless, where up to 1 million people have been disenfranchised. And, you know, instead of the Parliament being brought to a halt until there's an effective answer, the government seems to be shrugging its shoulders, and many parliamentarians seem to be letting them do it. Are you not kind of surprised there's not more outrage at what seems a huge abuse of democratic practice?
I'm surprised, but I'm also well aware that I think politicians are petrified of the will of the people mantra. I think if they felt that they were going against the referendum results, they would be perhaps committing political suicide. But I think the problem here really is that it was the timing of the Article 50 process being triggered. I think it was 7:30 the following morning that Jeremy Corbyn was calling for the immediate triggering of the referendum. Principles like good administration weren't thought about. It was a case of we must charge through with this as quick as possible. I would have suggested that from a legal point of view that Article 50 should have been triggered around about now, or at least after the European Union Withdrawal Act, which was actually more of a legal decision through Parliament saying, well, we're going to leave. It's now legislative. This is where we make the decision. Instead, they made it 2 years prior without probably understanding the legal ramifications and the clock ticking.
So as a lawyer, you would have advised your client, if you'd been advising Parliament about Article 50, you'd have said, listen, you better work out where you're going to end up before you begin the process. You should look before you leap. Yeah,
it's a case of, if you look at the mantra around Theresa May's deal, it wasn't the deal, it was the withdrawal agreement. It was sold as if this was the deal. Well, the deal was at least 2 years away from when it was actually agreed by our Parliament. That wasn't the deal. The deal's to be made through the framework for future relationships. That would be at least good administration to think through what was going to happen next, whether this was possible, whether that was possible. Most people probably didn't even understand that there would be an issue with the border in Ireland when it was originally triggered. The timing was terrible, and I really feel that parliamentarians, going back to where you were before, just didn't understand the legal ramifications or the implementations of triggering Article 50 so quickly.
Dr. Robert Palmer, I think a number of parliamentarians watching this programme might have wished you had been advising at that time, given what's happened over the last couple of years. So we can't go back to the triggering of Article 50, but what we can do is present you with Alex Salmond Quake for appearing in the programme. You know the drill.
That's
it's
beautiful.
Whiskey, in the Quake, round all your close friends, and only Scotch, of course.
Okay.
Robert, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Join us after the break when Alex asks parliamentarians in Brussels and Westminster how they intend to address the issue. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Despite Brexit, the European authorities are still concerned about reports of the elections in the UK disenfranchising European citizens. Alex turned to newly re-elected Labour MEP for London, Claude Moraes, to explain the political possibilities of enforcement action in Europe.
And I'm delighted to be joined by Claude Moraes, who's going to look at this issue from a European Parliament point of view. Claude, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Great to be on, Alex.
Now, Claude Moraes, the European Civic Forum estimate that between the European citizens who didn't get to vote in the UK and UK citizens who didn't get their postal votes in Europe, up to 1 million people were deprived of the right to vote in the recent European elections. Does that accord with your estimates?
Yeah, I mean, I think people have said that this European Civic Forum estimate sounds very high, but to be honest, Alex, people have accepted it, and I think it is extraordinarily high. And I think people are shocked by it. It's a lot of people, and if you think about it, these are active citizens who have lost one of the most fundamental rights, the right to vote, in what is a very sensitive election. So yes, it sounds very high, but of course it's the figures that we have. And it speaks to something pretty dramatic that has happened in our constitution.
Now, this is not a new issue. This has been raised before. The Electoral Commission had a report on the last European elections. So from your perspective, do you think this was a deliberate act by the government to disenfranchise people, or was it just a big blunder because they didn't expect these elections ever to be held?
Yeah, you put your finger on something very crucial here, Alex, that in the last few days here in the European Union, the big criticism coming from the Commission and from the EU has been that this shouldn't have happened because the warnings were there before. That's the big problem, that the European Union view of this is that everything that was warned about before, all the mistakes that happened before in terms of the franchise and the mistakes that we think have happened in this case, were written up last time. And I think that's what the EU is very frustrated about. This is not something that's happened for the first time. This is now the second time of asking. And I think given the sensitivity, given the referendum, given how dramatic our European elections were for the future of our politics, for Brexit, for the future of the EU, they should have learned these lessons. So it's a big criticism from here. People are very angry. We're very angry. We want remedies, of course, yeah, it's a mess that should not have happened.
Now, what are these remedies, Claude Moraes? Could the European Commission say, look, we're declaring your results unacceptable, we're declaring your results invalid, you better hold the election again until you decide what you're doing with Brexit? What can be done from a European perspective?
Well, I've just written with Molly Scott-Cato of the Greens, and it's a letter that's been signed by colleagues from the SNP. It's an all-party letter, and that letter is about an external investigation by the Vienna Commission. That is important. Our colleagues in the House of Commons are investigating this, of course, as we've just spoken about. The European Union is investigating. So there are a number of remedies all happening at the same time, as well as the obvious ones, the Electoral Commission and the Ombudsman in the UK. But we feel that the Electoral Commission and the Ombudsman, Alex, are not quite doing the full job and can't do the full job, which is why these additional remedies are being sought. But we need to move fast, and what I feel, and you know, this may sound a bit harsh, but what I feel is that the government, the Home Secretary, and I wrote directly to the Home Secretary, by the way, Sajid Javid, I feel that they just don't have a sense of urgency on this. I mean, they've referred it to the Cabinet Office, and they're just not moving fast enough, given the enormity of what has happened. So this is an all-party approach. We really feel people have been disenfranchised in such a fundamental way, and I want to work with other colleagues across the political spectrum to get this sorted. It's just an outrage.
And give us an example, Claude. What happens to other rogue states in democratic terms? I mean, what happened, for example, to Poland when it appeared to breach some democratic norms? Could these same sanctions be applied to the United Kingdom? You
know, when you ask the Vienna Commission to investigate a country like the United Kingdom, a sophisticated and important democracy, you would think people would be embarrassed by that, and I'm amazed that there isn't more embarrassment that we've asked for this to happen. This is normally something we ask of countries that have allegedly breached Article 7 of the treaties of the EU, countries like Hungary or countries recently like Poland. But we're asking this of the UK in relation to these votes. And that should have been embarrassing. The fact that you're not hearing much, you know, really worries me. But yes, I mean, you put your finger on something here, Alex, that we're asking for an external body to make an investigation, because what's happening in the UK at the moment is Brexit is producing many unintended or intended consequences, which is showing that our democracy is being damaged.
And finally, Claude Moraes, the attitude from the UK government, from the dispatch box, seems to be nothing much to see here. This is what's happened before. It's not really very important. All of this will blow over. Are they right or are they wrong?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're doing this interview, Alex, because one of the really frustrating parts of this is that there are good MPs in the House of Commons. Like I say, this is all party. There are good MEPs, there are good NGOs and others who are really fighting this case. But the government is not really up to the level of concern that there should be on something like this. And they really need to do it. And I'm really it really upsets me, frankly, that something like this hasn't caught enough attention. And I'm glad that you are, really many days after this, still keeping the heat on this story, because this is not something run-of-the-mill. And this is a massive disenfranchisement. You gave the figures earlier. So, yeah, good for you for keeping your eye on this story. But, you know, we're not anywhere near the end of this. We need answers. So I think let's keep the pressure on. The government is really not responding adequately.
Claude Moraes from Brussels, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Alex.
Thus far in the House of Commons, the government has dismissed concerns raised and have declined our invitation to explain their position on this show. This is what has been said in the Chamber.
On the EU citizens, as you said, that have made the UK their home, what about those citizens who were denied the right to vote at the recent European elections? What's the government going to do to redress that? And wasn't that a shabby treatment of those very citizens during that, what should have been an all-inclusive democratic process? It's just simply not good enough for that to be swept under the carpet in any manner of means.
Well, I don't think there has been any attempt to sweep that under the carpet. I remember, I think it was possibly the week before last, there was an urgent question in the House. I'm sure that the honourable gentleman will have raised his point there, but he will know as well as I do that it is best addressed to the Cabinet Office, who are responsible for elections, and not to me as the Immigration Minister.
Alex asked Angus MacNeil of the SNP about the next steps in Parliament.
Angus MacNeil, 1 million people estimated disenfranchised from voting in May's European election. And they'll all be asking, watching this show, what are the parliamentarians doing about it?
Well, it's shocking. Anything can happen in the currently shambolic United Kingdom. And it's an example probably of the government trying to choose the electorate and the electorate trying to choose the government. And I think it's one of those things that the European Union should be pressing on it, and particularly should be part of any withdrawal agreement, that a proper investigation is held into this, because as we've seen at Westminster before, if it's a Westminster-run thing, it'll probably be just a whitewash. And let's make sure that all European Union countries know, on the particular issues in the eastern side of Europe, that they know that if this sort of behaviour happens, this shambolic behaviour that we've seen in the United Kingdom with 1 million people disenfranchised, is not a penalty-less action.
Now, Angus MacNeil, yourself, a number of opposition MPs have been active on this issue, raising questions in Parliament, but the government's stance has been to wave it away, saying, look, these elections aren't really important. What can you do to make sure this issue has the prominence it deserves?
Well, I think your own programme is certainly covering it and giving it that prominence that it definitely deserves, but there are many other avenues where that has to happen as well. But listen, if this can happen now, if that step can happen, I mean, what's next? That's the sort of level of dissent that can go on, frankly, in the UK. But we really need to make sure...
So who do you suggest that Boris Johnson would want to disenfranchise next?
Well, there's a fair chance that it could be the Scots. We know that he's had his small little England viewpoint for quite a while. His Tory electorate have maybe been rougher than he expected. And he's never really liked the Scots. A pound spent in Croydon was always a pound better than being spent in Strathclyde. So we know what his gut instincts are. But, you know, going back to the more serious, substantial point, this European Union point cannot be ignored. The disenfranchising of voters cannot be ignored by any UK Prime Minister. It also, quite seriously, can't be ignored by the European Union either, because if a member state, as it still is behaving like that, any other member state can behave like that, and we know there are problems in Hungary and perhaps Poland in that way as well.
But the government argument, you know, if we try to take it seriously for a second, is, look, these elections were never meant to happen. We all know we're on our way out anyway. So what does it really matter if some here today, gone tomorrow Euro MPs were elected in a franchise that wasn't perfect? It's all going to come out in the wash anyway. Isn't there something in that government argument that, look, it's not the most important election that's ever been held in history?
There's only something seductive in that argument, and wrongly seductive. The substantial point is, if you're doing democracy, you do it properly. And a UK that is planning perhaps Brexit, perhaps not Brexit, perhaps hard Brexit, perhaps no Brexit, should be ready for every eventuality. Quite clearly in these European elections, the UK wasn't ready for the eventuality of it being held, certainly wasn't ready to include the European Union citizens, and should have made sure if it was holding this election, it was taking place, that it did it properly and made sure the people had the paperwork and could vote, and certainly shouldn't have been stopping them and blocking them from voting on polling day.
But then another argument might be this has all been done before. I mean, there was a guy held a a Scottish referendum on independence a few years back, and he enfranchised 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds. People used to say that was because he thought they would support independence. And then the Europeans were also allowed to vote in that referendum. Haven't governments through the ages tried to have an electorate which suited their purposes?
Yeah, I do remember that fellow in Scotland in 2014, and he was quite inclusive. He included everybody that lived in Scotland, be they from England, Ireland, Poland, Hungary, Spain, wherever. Had he held the referendum, incidentally, on the same basis as David Cameron held his election, by excluding everybody that wasn't native, and the referendum in 2014 was only native Scots, Scotland would now be independent.
You're not advocating that as a policy?
Certainly not. I think if we're going to move forward with Scotland, we move forward with everybody that lives in Scotland, and that is the best way to move forward and the way that brings harmony in the end. What is wrong with what the UK is trying to do, the UK is trying to cut corners. It is not as substantial and as thorough as Scotland was in the referendum that, of course, you yourself ran in 2014.
Well, finally, Angus MacNeil, what would your message be to the European citizens? Firstly, those who were deprived of their right to vote, and secondly, those who perhaps managed to get their form in on time, but are starting to think, you know, this is a kind of hostile atmosphere that's been created about citizens from other countries in this Brexit Britain. What would your message of reassurance to these people be?
Well, my message of reassurance would firstly be, don't take the avenue the UK government are taking of shrugging your shoulders and thinking, ah, well. I think they should explore absolutely every avenue, legal and political. They should pester their MPs, pester their MEPs, and make sure that this isn't swept under the carpet, that this is looked at and this is dealt with properly. Because democracy is too high a principle to be played with and to be dismissed in the way the UK government is dismissing it at the moment.
Will you undertake on this show that the new Prime Minister, when he comes in the next couple of weeks, that this will be one of the first questions you ask him?
It'll be the first letter I'll send to the Prime Minister asking about this and seeing what he's going to do, yes.
Angus MacNeil, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We may never know the true extent of the voting scandal in the European elections. However, in the absence of any official UK government estimate, the figure of 1 million suggested by the campaigners, that's 1 million people effectively deprived of the right to vote, carries weight and force. People effectively prevented or at least discouraged from voting on such a scale suggests a possible meaningful impact on the election outcome, particularly in a proportional election where every vote, or in this case every non-vote, does actually count. The government's defence seems waver thin. The fact that elections were not expected is no reason for them not to be held properly. The fact that the problems with the Europol registration had previously been canvassed makes the lack of remedial action all the more culpable. The fact that the organisation established to enforce election supervision, the Electoral Commission, failed to ensure the proper administration of an election points to fundamental flaws in the democratic fabric of the United Kingdom. After the serious question marks over the European referendum itself, which were only not judiciable because the referendum was non-mandatory, the United Kingdom seems to be on a bad run at the ballots. At the very least, it should temper UK criticism of other countries' democratic failures, given the possibility that up to 1 million people were effectively deprived of their democratic right to vote this year in this country. Better still, will the politicians find the necessary sense of outrage to enforce the minimum standards required to hold elections which are above board? From Taz and me and all It's the Show, it's goodbye for now.